All right, so we start with the second panel of this morning with an agenda item of particular interest. It was already mentioned today. It's the current state of Brexit. We have invited the EU chief negotiator, Mr. Michel Barnier, as well as the chairs of the EU committees of the UK House of Commons, Sir William Cash, and House of Lords, Lord Timothy Boswell. In that regard, a General Affairs Council was convened for today's morning, as you all know, where Mr. Barnier has to discuss with all EU 27 ministers the political declaration on the future relation with the United Kingdom. He thus had to cancel his participation at the COSAC meeting. He expressed his most sincere excuses to all of us and thanked us for our understanding under these circumstances. We are happy that the chair of the Committee on Constitutional Affairs of the European Parliament, Danuta Hübner, has agreed to give a keynote speech instead. Let me now introduce our distinguished speakers. As it was mentioned, Mr. Danuta Hübner, Sir William Cash, and Lord Timothy Boswell. Danuta, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and I would like to start with a sentence that we probably most of us agree with, that I belong to those who regret that UK has made the decision to leave the European Union, but of course I also respect and I also believe that the best option for all of us is a withdrawal which is based on an agreement, so a withdrawal that is on a basis of the withdrawal agreement. And I would like to share with you several comments on some dimensions of the Brexit process, and I will start with the process as such. As you know, in line with Article 50, practically all major European institutions have been involved in this process, and there is a rather specific role of the European Parliament. We are not negotiating, but we have a very specific role at the end of the process, when we have to accept or reject the deal through so-called consent procedure. And also I would like to say that because of that, the Parliament has been very strongly present and very strongly also active in the whole process, in debate and looking at the consequences of the Brexit for all stakeholders of this process. And we also have been present in the whole process since the day one, when the two leaders of European institutions met the day after the referendum on Brexit and made this joint statement in which they also declared the unity across the European Union, the unity between the institutions, the unity among the member states, and it's important that this unity has been maintained throughout the whole process. We have been, as a Parliament, responding to the challenges of this process in a typical parliamentary way through resolutions. We have also been together with other European institutions, and I'm sure that you have been on the same line with us, that this is an unprecedented process which requires also an unprecedented level of openness, of transparency. And this is, I think, as the negotiations have been conducted in good faith and also in full transparency. We have also organized ourselves within the European Parliament to be better prepared to perform our duties. We have this specialized structure, which is Brexit Steering Group, with 5 main political groups of the Parliament and the chair of Constitutional Affairs Committee, which is coordinated by Guy Verhofstadt. And this committee, which I am chairing, has been also made a platform for exchanges of views, of information of all those stakeholders who wanted to come and share with us their views. And we have been also doing through the structures the most important thing, which is receiving information directly from Michel Barnier and also contributing at all stages to the position of the European Union. I would also like to tell you that as AFCO chair, I had, for the last 2 years, I have had more than 350 meetings with stakeholders, both from UK and European Union 27, listening practically to everybody, from big enterprises to SMEs, from also groups of citizens to smaller communities, representatives from member states and national parliaments. Many of you have been also coming because you have established your task force for Brexit. So much on the process. I think it's important to see that the process was really very constructively organized on the EU side. Now, my second group of comments relates to the withdrawal agreement as such. You know that negotiations have been concluded on an orderly withdrawal last week. So Michel Barnier used this sentence, I think important sentence, that the decisive progress has been achieved. And the negotiators over a weekend, and as we speak, they are still talking and trying to find agreement on the important political element of the whole deal, which is political declaration on the framework of the future relationships. And if we manage to get in the coming days to come to the conclusion also on this, then we will have an important European Union summit already announced by President Tusk next Sunday. The withdrawal agreement, actually, there's nothing to rejoice, if I can say it this way, because the withdrawal agreement, in reality, as main objectives, has to minimize disruption on both sides for citizens, for businesses, to protect citizens' rights, and to avoid also a hard border between and the Republic of Ireland. I would also like to say that the withdrawal agreement is important because it is a precondition for having what everybody seems to see as important, which is transition period. The British friends call it implementation period, and we have been from the very beginning, from our first resolution, have been very clear that we need to avoid a cliff edge scenario by exit time. We need a transition period, also to give the EU-UK negotiators time to negotiate the future relationship. And as regards the future relationships, our understanding has consistently been that remaining close neighbors and sharing many common interests, the EU and UK should aim towards, should forge actually the closest relationship possible, which would protect and also promote those common interests. And now we have reached this crucial stage in this very painful process, and we have a compromise on the table which can organize the withdrawal in an orderly fashion, which can ensure no hard border on the island of Ireland, and which is also offering, once we finish it, a ground for an ambitious future, a new partnership agreement. What is important to understand that we have on the table a concise legal document which is providing legal security to all stakeholders in areas considered from the very beginning as crucial ones. So I also believe that this type of withdrawal agreement is also an important prerequisite for confidence-based future relationship and agreement on it. That's why I would say it's very difficult, it's actually impossible to imagine negotiations on the future on the basis of a no-deal scenario. And in what we have in the withdrawal agreement, if I can just mention things which I consider the most important, is certainly the European citizens' rights. The citizens that would come to either of the two destinations before the end of transition will have the right to spend their entire life working, studying, and bringing their families. We have also clarity that financial commitments made by the 28 will be honored by the 28. We also agreed that credibility of the withdrawal agreement depends in a very important way on the adequate implementation. That's why we also spare no efforts to find an agreement on the governance of this agreement and the role of ECJ in the interpretation of European law. And I also think that we have found a very rational solution for avoiding a hard border on the island of Ireland. We will spare no effort, and I would like to underline it, to reach this solution for the Irish border through the agreement on the future relations. But we also agreed a kind of safeguard. We agreed to jointly extend transition, making this decision 6 months before the end of transition already envisaged, if we need more time to negotiate the future. So we are still giving even more emphasis on the need to find the Irish solution through the future agreement. And only if the agreement on the future is not in place, we will reach out to the backstop. And I think it's extremely important to see that in looking for the backstop, we actually pursued a common goal, both sides, I would say, a common commitment to the Good Friday Agreement and common travel area, and backstop is not is not meant to be used if the future relationships will be negotiated and enter into force before the transition or the extended transition will cease to work. So let me also, just coming to the end, I just would like to make it very clear that where we are now in the European Parliament, we are analyzing this agreement. The same in those days, now the same is true for the member states. They are also working on understanding of everything that is in the agreement and sharing their assessment on the agreement. And if nothing extraordinary happens in this week, negative this week, then of course we will hold this European Council, which will formally conclude the process of negotiation. One more thing which I would like to add, which does not belong to negotiation, but I think it's important, especially for national parliaments, that in the meantime, there is a parallel process, parallel to negotiation of the withdrawal, so-called preparedness process taking place, while, I would repeat again, all efforts must be put into successful conclusion of withdrawal and political declaration. We also know that appropriate measures, emergency measures, must be identified and designed, allowing or aiming at mitigating all the effects or of the consequences of this most undesirable solution, which would be exit without withdrawal agreement and hence no transition. So let me conclude just by saying that we will be, after November extraordinary summit, waiting on the EU 27 side and also in the European Parliament, awaiting results of the meaningful vote in London, in Westminster, in UK. It will be, this meaningful vote will be fundamental for completion of the procedure on the EU side. We have a procedure which is consent procedure, which requires in the European Parliament it has to go through the Constitutional Affairs Committee, and then we have to have the vote in plenary, and we need simple majority for this. But also we need, finally, after the consent, after the Council will receive the positive consent from the Parliament, through QMV, the Council will make the final decision. We have to be done with all those procedures before the end of March, I mean, as much before the end as possible. And let me also underline that all, I think, European institutions, they are committed, we are committed also in the Parliament, to proceed as fast as possible with preparation of mandate for the negotiations of the agreement on the future relationship between EU and UK. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Danuta Hübner. Colleagues, I have to mention that we already have 36 participants in the debate, and you still can submit your requests for the floor until the end of the speech of Lord Boswell. Our next speaker will be Sir William Cash. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chairman. There's a saying in England which is, why read the crystal ball when you can read the book? There is a book, and the book is clear. The book is the manner in which we left the European Union. My European Scrutiny Committee put out a report, having examined these questions back in March this year, and we said that we thought that there was no doubt whatsoever that we had left lawfully. We did it in accordance with the Lisbon enactment and the treaty. We had a referendum that was passed by a significant majority, the biggest historic vote ever in British history. We then had the referendum act itself passed by the House of Commons by 6 to 1. 6 to 1 of all members of Parliament voted for the referendum. We then had the Notification of Withdrawal Act. That was passed by the British Parliament by 499 to 120. And then we passed the Withdrawal Act itself after a very vigorous debate. So both Parliament and the people, who were given the right by Parliament to make the decision for themselves, both said, we are leaving the European Union. So that is really the background. And I have to say, just to bring us right up to date, that when the Prime Minister came to the House of Commons with 585 pages of this massive document, which had been negotiated over a period of time, it took 1 hour before anybody got up to say that they supported it. It is generally understood, and as I said, I don't do crystal balls, but I am going to say this, that if you add up the numbers in the House of Commons, and we operate by a very, very clear democratic system with transcripts, proceedings, by votes that are recorded, by statements that are made and counter-statements, and everything is printed every day so anybody can see what anybody else has said. The reality is that the parties, on the face of what we see at the moment, have said that there is no chance that this withdrawal agreement will ever pass the House of Commons. The DUP have said as much, the Labour Party have said as much, the SNP have said as much. There are a significant number of my fellow Brexiteers who have said as much. And the numbers just don't add up for the government. So I think it's important to say that, because an awful lot of work's gone into this, but I'm afraid to say that it's led to resignations by very senior secretaries of state who do not resign lightly. We had David Davis resigned because of the way in which the Chequers deal was put through without sufficient consultation with the cabinet, and many of the material points in it too. And we also saw Dominic Raab leave, and he said, and let me put this to you, I can't support, this is the letter he wrote to the Prime Minister, for those of you who haven't read it. I cannot support the proposed deal for 2 reasons. First, I believe the regulatory regime proposed for Northern Ireland is a very real threat to the integrity of the United Kingdom. Secondly, I cannot support an indefinite backstop arrangement where the EU holds a veto over our ability to exit. And then he went on finally to say, above all, I cannot reconcile the terms of the proposed deal with the promises we made to the country in our manifesto in the last general election, which was quite clear that we were leaving, we accepted and endorsed the referendum result, and we were not going to go into the single market or the customs union. And basically, he then concludes saying, this is at its heart a matter of public trust. Now, it's a pretty strong letter coming from a departing Secretary of State who's been fully engaged in the process of putting together the details for this withdrawal agreement. But at the heart of it, it's what I said in the earlier meeting we had this morning on subsidiarity and things of that kind. And I'm not going to argue this on the grounds of subsidiarity, but I did mention democracy for this reason. You cannot have a governmental system in the British constitutional arrangements which does not enable the British Parliament to decide its own laws. Back in 1972, we did agree voluntarily that we would enter into the European community. It did say in that document, the white paper that went with it, that we would retain the veto. That was fundamental. It said so, because otherwise, as it said, we would be betraying our national interest, and it would destroy the European community if you didn't have a veto. It talks about the essential fabric of the community. So control over laws is fundamental to the British parliamentary system. And I'm not going to criticize other parliaments or other peoples or other countries or other systems. I am very critical, as people will know, of the way the European Union functions, behind closed doors, in the Council of Ministers, with out transcripts and so on and so forth. And there's going to be a debate about that later. But the reality is that it's not a sufficient degree of democracy for the purposes of the United Kingdom. But I want to come back to what the Prime Minister said, because when she made her Lancaster House speech, she says, "We do not truly leave the EU unless we regain control over our laws." Now, I could spend a lot of time going into the ways in which we would not control our own laws under the withdrawal agreement. But it's perfectly clear, for example, that the repeal of the 1972 Act, that is the Act which enabled the British Parliament to insist that all laws which come from the European Union will be obeyed by our Parliament and by our people, and also the rulings of the European Court of Justice. So it's axiomatic, it's fundamental to the basis on which we are in or out of the European Union as to whether or not that repeal act goes through. Well, I can tell you that on the 26th of June, and I played an enormous part supporting the Prime Minister, having private meetings with her and with other ministers and so on, to get that withdrawal act through. I say with great respect to my dear friend, the Lord Boswell, that the House of Lords took rather a different view, but let's leave them alone because they had to give in eventually. But let's leave that to one side, because the House of Commons has to prevail in the last resort on these matters. But the most important thing, if I may suggest respectfully to you to understand, is that that repeal of the 1972 Act was Section 1 of the Withdrawal Act itself, which passed the House of Commons, and even Kenneth Clarke, who some of you will know is one of the greatest Europhiles of all time, voted for that provision, or for that act. Therefore, the idea that under the withdrawal agreement there should be some method employed, and it's technical, but it comes down to this, that the 1972 Act will, as it were, be retained, is a completely different arrangement, and one that goes completely against what is now the law of the land. So the withdrawal agreement is in real trouble, and the European Court jurisdiction itself, which the Prime Minister frequently says is not going to be retained, is actually embodied, for example, in Article 174 and 89 of the withdrawal agreement. So then there is the Common Rule Book, which is the opposite of control of our laws, and changes to that rule book would also be done without our even being present at the table. I'm not saying we want to be at the table, but the idea that we would accept an imposition of laws made by 27 other member states without transcripts, without proceedings, behind closed doors in the way I've described, is completely unthinkable to the British way of life, to our entire tradition, our parliamentary arrangements. So there we are, and so I'm afraid that the withdrawal agreement has what appears to be a rather oblique future. Well, the next question, and I'm sure this is in your minds at the moment, well, what next? I think the date for the withdrawal agreement debate, the meaningful vote as it's called, would be likely to be sometime in December, I think. We're not quite sure of the date. But Clause 132 of the withdrawal agreement allows an indefinite extension of the implementation period. So we're now talking about questions of extending the arrangements for the implementation period. Absolutely not. People really do not see that as an option. Equally, they do not see a unilateral revocation. There's a case going on in the European Court, which has been referred by the Inner Court of Session in Scotland, as to Article 50, unilateral revocation of Article 50. Well, the government may or may not win that case. I personally hope they do, but I'm sincerely. But I have to say, the idea that the government will actually implement unilateral revocation sounds to me like cloud cuckoo land. And then there's the question of a second referendum. We don't do second referendums in the United Kingdom, and I'm not going to go on about that. I'll leave that to questions. So finally, I just simply say this. We also have the question of the role of the Prime Minister, and I'm not going to go on about that other than to say that nobody quite knows what's going to happen there, whether there are sufficient letters or not. You have to reach the threshold of 48, but that's a domestic matter, which I'm not going to enlarge on just at the moment. So basically, I think that we had every reason to leave the European Union. We would, as I said right way back in July 2016, I do trust that we will be, if not brothers and sisters, still cousins in the European environment. But I have to say that some of the manner of negotiations that have been conducted have not been entirely helpful in that respect. But having said all that, we'll learn to live with one another in a coherent manner, but we are not going to stay in the European Union when we don't control our own laws. It's as simple as that. And people might just recall the fact that in the European context, over the past 400 years, we have played a major part in defending Europe from fascism, from authoritarianism, for liberty, for democracy, and I must say, speaking for myself, and for many, many other people, the 17.4 million who voted, they will continue to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sir Kesh, for your insights. Our next speaker is Lord Boswell. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. May I first start with a personal comment to say how pleased I am to be able to return to COSAC after major heart surgery last year. In my British hospital treatment, I had a Cypriot surgeon, a Lithuanian cardiologist, and a Polish personal nurse. I'm now feeling much more fit and probably also much more pro-European. I particularly appreciated many expressions of best wishes from colleagues here, and I'm delighted finally to be able to catch up with so many old friends, one of whom, of course, and a former colleague, is Sir William Cash. And while our views may differ, I very much respect his determination to pursue debate and scrutiny and the process of sharing our experience with parliamentarians in different fora in Europe and wider afield. Now, coming to the substance, I want to be as frank as I can. And let's start with the pleasant part. It's always a pleasure to be here in Vienna. I only wish it were in somewhat happier circumstances. As I see it, the United Kingdom is more divided now than at any time I can remember. That's not just among the politicians, it's among the citizens as well. The Brexit referendum has unleashed an unprecedented depth of feeling on both sides of the debate that makes it difficult to see a way forward which can bring our country together. The Prime Minister has battled bravely to secure a deal that she believes can achieve that. But as you are well aware, the challenge of securing agreement from the House of Commons now threatens to overwhelm her government entirely. In short, we in Britain are now at crisis point, and I make a number of pleas to you as fellow parliamentarians. The first is a plea for understanding. When I addressed some of you at COSAC Chairs meeting in Bratislava, a few days after the referendum 2 years ago, I expressed my sorrow at the enduring failure of political leadership in the United Kingdom, which had led us to that outcome. I appreciate that the events of the last 2 years have been, for many of you, a further source of sadness, regret, frustration, and even anger. And as a committed pro-European myself, though no longer with a party affiliation, I can identify with those feelings. But the referendum was not an event in itself. It was the culmination of a tortured 40-year debate about the United Kingdom's conflicted sense of identity as a nation. Far from resolving that debate as was intended, the referendum has simply exacerbated the divisions within our nation in a dangerous and potentially destabilising way. As events in London over the last few days have demonstrated, it's extraordinarily difficult for the government to move forward. There is no quick fix to these divisions. I understand the calls of many in our country for a so-called people's vote. But unless there's a clear and demonstrable shift in public opinion that could justify such a drastic step, it's difficult to see how another vote would resolve the issue. All the polling evidence suggests that the result would be just as close. And another referendum would undoubtedly be a bitter and divisive campaign, fueling the suspicions of many people in our country about a political elite that ignores the views of ordinary citizens. And that, in turn, could unleash the forces of populism that we see in many countries around the world. My second plea, then, colleagues, is therefore for patience. As you know, and as Mr. Barnier has consistently reminded us, the clock is ticking. But even if the legal arrangements for the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union can be settled by the 29th of March next year, not much over 100 days from now, this national trauma, the political debate about the United Kingdom's relationship with the European Union, will continue. The political situation is so febrile that it's impossible to predict what will happen in the coming days, let alone in the coming months. We have a saying, if you have the answer to the question, you're probably not well informed. The nation and its political leaders need time and space to reflect and to reach important decisions on the future of our country, perhaps the most momentous decisions any of us can recall. The Article 50 process is clear, but the time may yet come when the United Kingdom makes a request for flexibility within the timing constraints that it lays down. My third plea, perhaps the most important of the three, is that neither side in this debate should, to use an English idiom, burn their bridges. The Brexit negotiations have been fraught and difficult for both sides, and they will continue to be. It would be easy for one side or the other to give up out of a sense of frustration, exasperation, or simply because time ran out. A no-deal outcome would hurt us all, and we must do everything we can in our power to avoid it. And let me be clear on 2 points. No deal would be the worst possible outcome for the maintenance of peace on the island of Ireland, and, separately, it would be the worst possible outcome for the 4 million European Union and United Kingdom citizens who have exercised free movement rights. And we all share a responsibility to avoid such an outcome. I can't at this stage predict what the outcome of this painful process will be. I, for one, hope that the United Kingdom's future relationship with the European Union will be as close as possible. And I regret that so late in the process, the terms of that future relationship are still so vague. But in such turbulent times, first and foremost, it's essential that we keep the lines of communication open. One of the ironies of Brexit is that it has actually intensified our interparliamentary dialogue. We've welcomed you many of you to London, and we visited many of your national parliaments to discuss the implications. Whatever the future holds, we must hold on to that closeness. So we will welcome the opportunity to participate in future meetings of COSAC and of other interparliamentary bodies, to engage with the European Parliament and to visit any of your national parliaments in the pursuit of bilateral dialogue. So finally, Mr. President, while I cannot predict the outcome of the Brexit process, what I do know is that we move towards the climatic decision. There are some general principles which apply to all of us, both in Britain, but I believe also elsewhere in Europe. First, we should have regard to our shared heritage and democratic values and make our long-term arrangements accordingly. Secondly, we should resist short-termism and the chanting of slogans at each other when electors are looking to us to take a strategic view. And third and finally, we should all remember that behind the facade of debate lie the real interests of individuals in their jobs, travel, education and healthcare, to say nothing of their security and economic future. Put simply, we have together not to let them down. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Lord Boswell. Colleagues, we now move on with our debate. A lot of you signed up for the debate. We have 37 speakers all together. So please hold your individual remarks within 1.5 minutes. The first speaker is from Italy, Ettore Antonio Licheri. You have the floor.
Gentile Presidente.
Dear President, dear colleagues, I share our joint attitude of expecting this exit of the Brexit affair, and I was listening to Sir William Cash and Lord Timothy Baldwin with great interest. So allow me to say that Brexit seems to be the detonator of this European crisis, a crisis that started a long time ago and that has to do with globalization and with the fact that confidence has waned. It's something that makes us forget our joint historic roots in a Europe that, as President Mattarella said in one of his recent speeches that he made in La Spezia, in a Europe that is not and cannot be just a business enterprise. The UK referendum gives me the impression that somebody might think that if you become a third country, you're no longer a European country, that you lose your European character, that you use your laws, that you use your history. We would say very clearly from this meeting that the British people are and will always remain European citizens, and the agreement between London and Brussels will have to be acceptable and dignified for a sovereign country, otherwise it cannot be accepted. If you're intransigent, that would mean that the European spirit would be infringed. And I'm saying that because even the disagreement between the Commission and Italy. Well, if you say that if you do not expect just one financial parameter, it means that you can be excluded from Europe. That would mean that the European dream would no longer be considered. It would no longer be based on joint values. It would be regarded as a purely financial thing. If national problems, after many years of European development have now been killed, that would no longer be in line with our story. Thank you.
Netherlands, Peter.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the two introductions and for our Italian colleague. And it would be good to talk about the Italian situation next time. Because finally, we're talking about a main topic here at COSAC, and that is Brexit. It's a great pity that the UK is leaving at the moment. And in the Netherlands, we're very anxiously awaiting the outcome of the British political process. The fact that there doesn't seem to be a majority either for the withdrawal agreement or for the remain position or for the leave position without an agreement means that the countries like my country, the Netherlands, have to prepare for all three eventualities. That is imposing a cost on taking on new people for our borders, on employing new customs officials and making costly preparations. I very much look forward to an answer from the two esteemed British colleagues in when the British will reach a decision and what they need, because it's their sovereignty. They can decide which way they want to go, but then we can deal with it. I have to say that some of the British points are very valid. The point about secret decision-making is a valid point and was shared by more than 30 parliaments here. And we shall bring it up later. So the sign of the Brexit, that not everything is going perfect in the EU, should be taken seriously. And yes, we shall aim for a deep and constructive future relationship with security cooperation and with other necessary cooperation. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Next from Ireland, Bernard Durkin.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I think that having listened to Lord Boswell, I think it's a good time to record what was essentially a warning to us all European countries, at a time when there appears to be a consensus in some quarters of moving apart as opposed to moving together. Historians will tell us, and rightly so, about what happened when we moved apart in the past. If we move in that direction, one country today, another country tomorrow, if we move in that direction, we will pay a high price, individually and collectively. And there's no sense in trying to minimise the potential for that. I know that one of my colleagues mentioned a few moments ago about reading the book, and I would refer to John Donne, who wrote the book, and he said very importantly, 500 years ago, no man is an island. Each is a part of the continent, part of the entity. And he finished up by saying, at the end of that particular verse, he said, and therefore do not send to know for whom the bell tolls, lest it tolls for thee. So I would say that there's an old Irish saying, and incidentally I want to congratulate Michel Barnier and the negotiators for the negotiations that took place over the past number of months. It was a very tedious job, it was a difficult job, it was a thankless job, but they did conclude, and they came to an arrangement, an agreement, whatever we want to call it. Hopefully it will be followed by a success in the UK. The last point I want to make is simply this. There's an old Irish saying, Ní nath go corle céile, no strength without unity. I think it is timely for us all to look at it now and to say, Arailin go céile. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Next speaker, Elias Mirantus, Cyprus.
Ευχαριστώ κύριε Πρόεδρε. Κύριε Πρόεδρε, αγαπητοί συνάδελφοι, με την αποχώρηση του Ηνωμένου Βασιλείου.
Thank you very much. When the United Kingdom leaves the European Union, that will mean that the remaining 27 states show solidarity to all their citizens, and this would mean that there will be no further exits. I think that's very important to ensure that the voices of nationalism and those wishing to leave do not grow in strength. It's important that the interests of all participating be borne in mind. Such an agreement that we need should reflect the interests of all citizens. What's more, we think that the United Kingdom's exit will come about in a way that it will stay as close as possible to the EU. Now, through this agreement, there must be a transitional period, which we think will be very important for all concerned. And what's more, as regards the rights of citizens and of those who lived in the different military bases, and I'd like to thank Mr. Barnier for the negotiations on this point. We've ensured that the rights of these individuals will be respected in the future as well. And what's more, I would urge and press the House of Commons to support this initiative. Yes, thank you very much, Chair. I'll try to be brief. First of all, the day on which the United Kingdom chose to leave the EU was not a good day for the EU or for Europeans. I think that needs to be said at the outset. The United Kingdom will always be a friend of the European Union and of Europe, but things are as they are. And whereas Sir William says no customs union and no single market, but there should be no border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, I doubt, or my fear is, that we're trying here to square the circle. That won't be possible. At the moment, we have a Brexit agreement before us, and we can assume that we have to negotiate. And I agree with what the speaker said. We need flexibility as regards the time, and without that, it probably won't be possible to come to an agreement. So the relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union be further regulated. And let me add something. We need a deal to that end, but without a deal, without an agreement on that, there won't be the necessary flexibility. And finally, just one comment, or at least let me put one question, which I'd like to share with all present. I'm exceedingly grateful for the negotiation and for the way that Michel Barnier led it. I'm very grateful. And he did this after Article 50, but the question is, and we need to address this, is that perhaps a mixed agreement, because it goes beyond what was actually contained in Article 50. And then let me conclude with one sentence. The week before last, I heard this in London from a member of the House of Lords, who said, the best Brexit is no Brexit. And I think that is the truth.
Thank you, Markus Tanz. Our next speaker is Jean Bizet from France.
Well, with Brexit, we're facing a very paradoxical situation. After more than 40 years of convergence and being involved here, we now have to try and undo everything and to learn to manage this divergence with the least losses possible. So we're having a real major problem here. It's, of course, the absolute right of the UK to leave if that's what they want, but that choice has one consequence. It will no longer be able to use the biggest market in the world with as much facility as it had so far. Because if you want to leave, you have disadvantages. That is what the UK seems to want, but it also means that there are consequences that it does not want to take. For example, the four freedoms. We've always said that the state cannot want to get more advantages from being outside the union than it has from being inside the union. I think that a number of us see it this way. I would also like to thank Michel Barnier, the main negotiator, for his work. He has been able to keep the unity of the 27, and he made us feel that we really do belong fully to the first economic market of the world. If that draft agreement would be approved by the European Parliament, and there are major chances that it is. We have doubts that it will be accepted by the UK Parliament as well. We've seen what the government has thought about this. There were quite a number of resignations. Despite the fact that both parties want to reach an agreement, it is possible that there might be a failure at the end of this. So you have to think already of all the possibilities and be prepared for those. France has done this, and on the 6th of November, the Senate voted the draft law, which will allow the government to take all the measures to make sure that there will be no legal void on our national territory, and to help the companies to face the difficult future that may lie ahead of them. Thank you.
The next speaker from Estonia, Kalle Palling.
Dear colleagues, Ms. Hübner, Tim, Bill, thank you for the introduction for the topic. But I'd like to start with one thought I had, that we tend to underestimate the role of national parliaments in this debate. I mean, we are putting too many statements on the table and less advice, because as Tim and Bill clearly said, it has been an internal issue in UK. And currently we are heading into a phase where we probably see an internal crisis in the UK by having maybe new prime minister even. So, so I'd like to ask from Tim and Bill that what is going to be next. Because one thing that seems to be clear is that if it would be UK's choice to make, then the Brexit definitely won't happen in the 29th of March 2019. So we would really like to help as parliamentarians to find the agreement so that we don't demolish the bridges, and we will, let's say, keep the bridges. But it's clearly hard to achieve something like that if you don't have one position internally. Thank you.
Thank you vielmals. Als nächstes
Thank you very much. Next is Hans-Peter Boardman from Switzerland. Chairman, dear colleagues of our neighboring parliaments, first of all, I'm not going to speak English today, but since we're in Austria, this wonderful country, I'm going to speak German, proper German, not Swiss German, and we are, of course, thanking you for being able to take the floor and to have the right to speak as well, which is another proof that there is neighborhood and a European friendship, even if you're not a member of the European Union. You know that at the moment, Switzerland is also trying to negotiate a framework agreement in parallel to the Brexit agreement, and we're looking with great interest to the results of the Brexit. I would like to say to our friends from the UK that we have 25 years of knowledge of these contracts with the EU, and we've been able to work with the EU in a very friendly way. Please do keep that. You don't have to give up British law. We didn't have to do that either. But at the same time, I would say to our friends from the EU to please don't forget the specificities of individual countries. There are cultural, traditional reasons why somebody doesn't want to be or cannot be a member of the European Union. And please make sure that these countries can keep their specificities as well.
For your statement, next in line is Regina Bastos from Portugal.
Thank you very much, Chairman. First of all, I would like to thank Sir William Cash and Lord Boswell for the very clear and very honest words that they had for us, and which they used for the introductory statements. The UK and Portugal have been allies for a long, long time. There are many points in our joint history where we always got the very magnanimous support of the UK, and we certainly won't forget that. In the European Union, Our relationship has developed in a very positive way, not just for us from Portugal, but for all members of the European Union. And this exit, due to the result of the referendum and the wish of the British people, is something which we see as a real loss, a loss for all of us, for the whole European Union. There's absolutely no doubt as to that. The negotiating procedure that should lead to Brexit has been accompanied by an internal political crisis, and that is another reason why we're terribly concerned here. I would like to express our solidarity with Prime Minister Theresa May. It's an extremely complicated negotiation process, such as we have never seen, that she had to manage, and it was up to her to find solutions there. And I'd also like to acknowledge how constructively the main negotiator of the European Union, Michel Barnier, was leading the negotiations on behalf of the EU. Whatever the result of this extremely difficult negotiation will be, we hope very much that the negative consequences will be as small and as limited as possible. The 400,000 Portuguese people who are living in the UK, of course, have been considered in this agreement, and at the same time there are, however, many British people who live in Portugal, and that they can remain in Portugal is, of course, obvious. The Council on the 25th of November will hopefully make the necessary corrections in this proposed agreement and contract. We've already heard today that there might be some corrections. As Lord Boswell said, we will certainly do our share to make sure that, if at all possible, we'll be able to avoid a hard Brexit. Thank you.
Slovenia has the floor.
I would also like to congratulate you and to welcome everybody else here. But before you go apart, you have to ask yourself what has happened. Why do you want to get apart? How are you going to live after the divorce? Are you going to work together or against each other? And what sort of obligations you have due to your previous life? That is a question you have to ask every time there is a divorce. The Brexiteers didn't ask this question and didn't give any replies to it. Even the best of possible parliamentary systems on the island doesn't help if you haven't raised the question. Brexit means that there will be a lot of different ideological interpretations. There was quite a misleading information as well. It's a question of the media and the responsibility of the media. There were so many lies broadcast which made it very difficult to analyze the problems. But we are friends and we should have done that. And there were people who then came up with a lot of news that then disappeared. When Monsieur Barnier came to us in the Parliament, I said that the positive message of Brexit is that you can see where these populistic messages go. That is one of the key elements. I fully agree with the Estonian colleague that the role of the national parliaments in trying to solve the question has to be borne in mind. Thank you.
Next, Imren Mehmetova from Bulgaria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, Brexit is a challenge to and a trial to the European Union in its ability to act in crisis. In order to define our future relations, we need an ambitious agreement focusing on trade and security. For Bulgaria, it is of great importance to respect the citizens' rights. We must be reassured that our citizens will be protected from any discrimination. After Brexit, all citizens of the European Union who live in the United Kingdom should have to apply for a special status to stay there. Rumors have it that there are guarantees by the Theresa May's government they will stay. They can stay after Brexit, but they have to apply through a certain procedure for this status. the citizens of the European Union and their families after that could stay in Britain. However, people fear that a great number of the citizens of the European Union will not be able to cover requirements for this status. We insist on a better information campaign for citizens and guarantee that their rights will be protected.
Thanks. Next, Richard Hercik, Hungary.
Thank you for the floor, Mr. Chairman, and special thanks for our British colleagues, Sir William Cash and Lord Boswell, for their contribution. I find it important to mention that the chief negotiator, Barnier, enjoys the strong support of the 27 member states, and this unity among us in such challenging times is worth to be think of. In the Brexit discussion, Mr. Chairman, damage control is often mentioned as the goal of the negotiations. In the short run, this is definitely the case. On the longer, however, we in the European Union should draw the conclusions also for ourselves. Whether and how far can we provide security and well-being for our citizens? Let me make a final remark, Mr. Chairman. In about 130 days, the United Kingdom will become a third country, and the number of the member states will drop to 27. It is not fortunate to realize an empty seat at the European family table. I am eager to receive the 28th member states from the Western Balkans back again to 28 members or even more. The sooner, the better. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Next speaker is our
Ja, danke, Herr Vorsitzender, und einen besonderen Dank für die gute Vorbereitung.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the excellent preparation and organization.
Panelists to speculate about what would be the consequences if the UK would remain in the EU after all, whether via a second referendum or in any other way. There are quite a few Brexiteers who now appear to realize that also from their perspective, unless one wants to accept a no-deal outcome, leaving may be actually worse than staying in, because one arguably staying in or leaving has to indefinitely accept many rules of the single market without having any say about them. So from this perspective, might it not be better and effective to reform the EU from the inside? And would it therefore be conceivable, and I'm also asking this to Ms. Hübner, that we would reopen the debate that we at the time had with the Cameron government and address the concerns of the majority of the British people? These concerns, it is at least my impression, were not just about the free movement of labour, but also about the single market more widely, and generally about the feeling that the EU has come to reach too far into the domestic affairs and lives of the citizens in the EU's member states. This in contravention to the principle of subsidiarity. And is this not indeed a debate that in any case we should actually have within the EU? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Next is Soraya Rodriguez, Spain.
Microphone, please.
De una decisión adoptada por
So there was a decision adopted by the British people, but not one that most Europeans wanted. I think that Barnier and his team have worked very well. And I think some things have remained very clear, which strengthen us as a union. Firstly, no bilateral negotiation will be possible between the UK and the countries of EU, which could discriminate against some countries or between some countries and the citizens of others will negotiate as 27, as a bloc. Secondly, the EU cannot limit immigration, try to discriminate against European citizens, hindering the freedom of movement of individuals within the area, but while trying to promote freedom of movement for goods and services. Now, we know that the United Kingdom will leave at the end of March and will not apply EU law. So we need to listen and consider alternatives to a treaty, for example, which might be to stay within the customs union or bilateral agreements. But let me point out that a bilateral agreement which were offered by the EU with zero customs is what we have. It's called the customs union, a customs union which establishes a common rate for external borders and shared and common responsibilities of community law and a community contribution. Those who don't wish to adopt these responsibilities, then the EU needs to explain to British people and British companies how it's going to sort this out if there's no agreement. And yet it still wishes to have access to a market of 520 million people. So the time has come to listen to specific, to tangible alternatives.
So next, Günther Kirschbaum from Germany. Thank you, Chair. And first, so Lord Boswell, Timothy, it's very good to see you here, so healthy, and I'd like to say welcome back home. So the first remark that I'd like to make, I would direct to William Cash. We've been hearing this for weeks, for months. You don't want this agreement. But today, this morning, I haven't heard a single word from you about what the alternative should be. You speak. You're not talking about the alternatives at all. So we have an agreement on the table. And I look at it from the point of a national parliamentary, and I have to say, who says that we find everything good which is in this agreement? So Great Britain should continue to be a member of the customs union, but at the same time, despite this membership, there should be restrictions on freedom of movement. And that's not acceptable. So these four fundamental freedoms of the European Unions are indivisible. And that's not acceptable for us. And then my colleague, Markus Thöns, made another point. We have this withdrawal agreement on the one side, and then we have the European Parliament who are allowed to ratify this. On the other side, the future relationship, we're the ones affected as national parliaments. So 585 pages. There's details affect national competences and national sensibilities. So we're talking here about a mixed agreement. It makes it necessary that the national parliament should ratify. So it's all wonderful. It's not all quite so wonderful, which is what's on the table. So we have to have a discussion about that. And it must be said that 2 minutes is not really long enough to explain this. But please allow me, Chair, to say that our solidarity, our unrestricted solidarity, stays with Ireland, because Ireland is and will remain a member of the European Union. Thank you, Günther Kirschbaum. Next is Simone Satur from France.
It's near absurd that in a world which has 8 billion inhabitants, Europe is so divided. Scotland and Northern Ireland largely voted against this, but they're being dragged against their will into Brexit. As to defense, Europe is losing a lot. It has 2 seats at the United Nations Security Council, and now Europe will only have 1. But we need to be pleased nonetheless that negotiators came to a draft agreement on the 13th of November on an ordered exit. Now, we in the French Senate, we've supported this work done by the EU, because if a state decides to leave, we cannot allow the pillars of European construction being undermined, thinking about freedom of movement of the single market, nor to force onto a third party or allow them the same or more advantages than a member state. That would be the end of the EU. So we welcome the work done by Michel Barnier in his negotiation to defend these principles and preserve the unity of the 27. And we can assure you that this agreement does not question the major principles of the agreement. We note this, but we think about the follow-up, as many have said. The British Prime Minister Theresa May has done what she can, and her friends don't make her task any easier. Our colleague William Cash has just confirmed that. So we're cadent in France, we're preparing for the worst. So it's up for us. We need to vote for a law which will give the French government major powers in case of no agreement, and repeat what we have heard this morning. That just confirms that we are quite right to do so.
Merci beaucoup. Next speaker, Arto Satonen, Finland.
Thank you, Chairman. We are very happy in Finland how the EU and Michel Barnier handled these negotiations. It has been very important that the EU 27 has been united throughout the negotiation phase. Thank you to all of those 27. It is clear that the European Union, you can't go out without getting some sort of competitive advantage compared with the member states that stay in. So we will wish that the withdrawal agreement will be approved both at the European level and in Britain. Brexit without a deal would lead to everyday problems to EU citizens, to Britons, and a deal without a Brexit without deal would also have an impact on the well-being of people, because it would be disadvantaged economically. So I hope we will stay friends after the Brexit. Britain is a great military country, education, financially, and in research. So we need to continue working together with Britain even in the future, and also have a very good trade with Britain even after the Brexit. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Margarida Marques, Portugal.
Thank you, Chair.
E sublinhar a unidade dos 27 até hoje. E esperamos que esta unidade se mantenha até ao fim. Lembro que foi dado a Cameron
like to thank Michel Barnier and express our support and continuing support for him. So I hope that he can reach the desired outcome by the end of the negotiations. So it's something of a Pandora's box, isn't it? We have the treaties. We have to find answers for this. So the borders between the two Irish states, between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, we have to ensure there's no border. We do not want to see a return to things happening which we believe belong in the past, and at the same time we need something for the future. We are waiting for Great Britain to ratify this agreement. However, it must be said that Great Britain can't offload their costs, the costs of their and disunity onto the European Union. We can't take these over. So agreements must be adhered to, and treaties must be adhered to. And the best scenario in our point of view would naturally be that there would be no Brexit. And I would like to say to Lord Boswell, well, he said that we shouldn't burn our bridges, so I quote him, and I think that would be the worst thing that we could do. Thank you very much.
Next speaker, our colleague from Ireland, Gerard Crowell. Pardon, it's Romania, it's Gabriela Cretu.
Thank you very much, Chair. Dear friends and colleagues, by now we have discussed mainly the mechanic of Brexit, praising or criticizing negotiators for their works and Michel Barnier for this almost unexpected completion of negotiations. this stage. We have avoided to discuss deeply about the causes and cures of exit and to take stronger actions in this respect, to cure our European societies, I mean, to learn the lessons. Exit have already been sold as solution for everything in many countries, with enough support for making Eurosceptical parties to get important votes in May next year, including in Romania, usually a very pro-European country. Raw exit, it has been launched by some in online as public subject. We haven't taken as serious as needed the reason determining citizens to make such options. During the latest 2 decades, inequality increased together with social divide between winners and losers of our economic neoliberal reforms. Public services have been undermined by austerity and by ideological privatization. Many citizens have been lost in transition in newer member states. The haves and haves not live in different worlds, not only in different districts of a town. And our governments, almost everywhere, very effectively succeeded in making European institutions the scapegoat for all this disaster, sometimes with these very institutions' active contribution or weaknesses. Perhaps European Union is better placed in dealing with negotiations, but unfortunately we are not less divided as our British colleagues. We have to fill the gap, the social gap, firstly, promoting stronger policies to protect day-to-day life of citizens, not only our borders, for not fueling anti-European feelings and keeping the Union united. The current proposals on the table are not enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next is Shera Crowell, Ireland.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to say a couple of words now in Irish because Ireland is remaining in the European Union. Brexit is a huge problem for the Irish people, all of us. The majority of people on the island are pro-European, and now in English.
As I have said, most of the people of Ireland, north and south, are pro-European. And I would ask their lordships, Sir William and Lord Boswell, to address one issue for me. The Good Friday Agreement is a tripartite agreement between the Republic of Ireland, the citizens of Northern Ireland, and Britain. When you decided to hold a referendum on exiting the European Union, which I find deeply regrettable as great friends of Ireland, but when you decided to hold that referendum, did you once consider discussing the matter with the people in the Republic of Ireland? For we are a party to the agreement that has brought peace to our island. We are a party to the agreement that has opened the borders. That very few people, I'm very grateful to most of the parliamentarians that have visited Ireland and have visited our border, but very few people remember in this room what it was like to live on the island of Ireland with a border. And I fear deeply for the future of my country if we do not get this right. I am deeply grateful to Michel Barnier for what work he has done. I'm deeply grateful to all of the parliamentarians who have come to Ireland to see for themselves what our border is, what it means. And I am deeply, deeply hurt by the decision of the United Kingdom to withdraw from the European Union. For most of the points you made with respect to the need for change in Europe were valid points. But why didn't you stay, for God's sake, and help us all to reform Europe? Why are you walking away? Thank you.
Next speaker, Anne Mulder, Netherlands.
Dank u, voorzitter.
Thank you, Chairman. And my thanks to the speakers for their introduction. My thanks to the British colleagues for their hospitality whenever we visited London to discuss Brexit. Let me be honest about the British situation. I have never seen such a political mess as I've seen there. A cabinet that's divided, a parliament that's divided. There's no majority for anything at all. That is not a positive signal, a good signal. And perhaps in December, at bullet point, you'll have to choose what you want. But let me do away with this element of anger, because we need to remain calm and peaceful, and we need to keep the Brits as close as possible in the future as well. We don't need to punish them any more than they have themselves for the Brexit. We do not have to fear people who say other countries might leave. We must show, on the contrary, that we are capable of doing something about cross-border problems such as the climate and safety and security and migration. For the rest of it, I wish the British colleagues a lot of wisdom for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Antonio Guterres, Spain.
Thank you very much, Chair. My first words are to thank our Austrian colleagues for the very warm welcome to this city, one of the most beautiful in the world. Distinguished colleagues, we're at a critical moment to establish relations between the EU and the United Kingdom. I think a great effort has been made to achieve that, and I think at the moment we need to think about the circumstances we're in. I'd also like to thank Mr. Barnier for his skill and his prudence. But, colleagues, I think that at the moment it's not the time to talk about the origins or the cause of Brexit or what the consequences will be. Rather, what we need now is for we members who make up COSAC to bear our responsibilities, each of us, before our own parliaments. The agreement is not a final point. It's a point of departure by which to establish strategic relations with the United Kingdom. We are obliged to come to an agreement. And the future of Europe can only be seen as a special relationship with the United Kingdom. What's more, my country, Spain, has made every effort to come to this agreement, defending its interests, but without the issue of Gibraltar being an obstacle to agreement. As you can see, we have a technical agreement. And during the transitional phase, we'll be able to talk about issues of sovereignty. But now, colleagues, in our conclusions, we need to send a clear message, a unanimous and clear support of all of us for the agreement. Thank you.
Next is Alessandro Scigliovina from Italy.
Thank you, Chairman. And hello to all the colleagues here. It is a difficult moment, certainly, this Brexit question. But despite this, we still think that the experiment of Brexit is an experiment and experience in democracy. And it shows that people have a right for autodetermination. But we've said this already. We'll now have to look to the future, and what we are interested in, the Italian government, the Italian parliament, and the Italian people, is that our companies be protected, and especially in the agro-food sector and all the other sectors where we're working in or with the UK. And we want to make sure that our 700,000 Italians who live in the UK be protected. Most of them are young people who live and work in the UK, and they have adopted London as their second home. Hundreds of Italians work in London alone. And for us, this is obviously a question of national interest to make sure that our Italian citizens can be protected. We hope that the UK and the European Union will do their utmost to secure this, and we hope that the EU will not choose the option of punishing the UK. We hope that this agreement will be reached in a spirit that works for both parties, obviously, with one major aspect, namely securing and protecting not just ourselves and Europe, but the world as such, the UK. And we should not go towards an approach where the UK will be punished. We have to fight against terrorism together. I wanted to launch an appeal, which I didn't have the chance to launch earlier on. I think that we have to tell the EU, do not abandon us, do not abandon Italy, and do not abandon Southern Europe as far as migration is concerned. The migration and immigration has to look at what is happening to the Mediterranean countries, and we have to make sure that whoever enters the European Union can then be accepted there in the spirit of the Dublin resolution. Thank you.
From Sweden, Eskil Erlandsson is our next speaker.
Thank you, Chair. Between the UK and the European continent, we have a fellowship in cultural terms, and we have cultural ties. And since very old, we also have an exchange of services and goods. And all of this has been done by people, and I'm going to talk about people. People move, and they work, study, on both sides of what we will be seeing, a border between the European continent and the United Kingdom. And those people, they want to feel safe and secure. They find someone they want to marry, someone somewhere else. They have children. Those children want to be able to go to school, and they want to be able to feel safe and secure. And we can sort all those things out if we write an agreement where we decide on the future relationship. And this is my appeal to everyone, that try to stand behind and support this agreement that has been negotiated, or if we do not, we will just create insecurity. No one wants insecurity, and that will just to lead to more of the developments that we see on the continent and in the United Kingdom. Thank you.
Mrs. Renske-Leijten from the Netherlands, you have the floor.
Dank u wel.
Thank you, Chair. A lot is being said. This Brexit process should not be about punishment, but I do believe it would be a good idea, once all of this is behind us, we see or look at how EU 27's position was. We can look at what happens in the UK. No majority for staying in, getting out, or the future. But the self-declared unity that we have shown might have contained some element of punishment, after all. When I look or listen to my German colleague saying it isn't clear whether the deal we have now is good, then I wonder there might be a difficulty in getting a Brexit which is not assessed positively on the island and not assessed positively by the 27 other states. Perhaps the final outcome will not be a good deal for the future. So it might be a good idea to think about how we at national parliament level may strengthen ourselves to make a positive contribution and to find ways of coming to negotiations and conclusions other than by putting it into the hands of a few negotiators. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Titus Coalețian, Romania.
I would like, first of all, to thank the Austrian presidency and, of course, the three distinguished speakers for their contribution to our important panel. I was thinking to the fact that while chairing the special committee of the Romanian Parliament during the past months for the preparation for the next Romanian EU presidency of the Council, the Brexit was one of the most important topics on our agenda, so we are preparing our presidency also how to chair, how to manage this important fight. It might be complicated. But I have checked half an hour ago with the minister in charge, the Romanian minister in charge with the European affairs in Brussels. He confirmed me that the member states during the session of the General Affairs Council considered and approved the agreement together with Michel Barnier as being a fair and a balanced agreement. So it's up to the British authorities now to take a final decision on that topic. I was following with great attention the interventions of the two distinguished speakers from UK. The first one mentioned the fact that it's sure that there will be no referendum and UK will leave the European Union. The second distinguished panelist mentioned the fact that it's impossible to predict what will come in the next days, making the reference to the chances for the approval of the agreement in the British Parliament. So now it's a European message among us. While maintaining, and this is a must, the cohesion and the unity of the positions among the member states and the European institutions in charge with the subject, I think it's important to work in a nuanced way, in a detailed way, also to the Plan B, in a very pragmatic way. Of course, the preference is to have the ratification, the approval of the agreement by the British Parliament, but we should look in much more detailed and nuanced way in a possibility of a Plan B, of a no-deal Brexit based on a no-deal agreement. That will generate negative consequences, and of course the legal vacuum will generate a disaster for different point of view. First of all for the British friends, but also for us. So we're prepared to manage the file during the Romanian presidency. We hope that there will be this agreement, and based on that, we are engaged to support an enhanced cooperation after the Brexit based on the agreement with UK based on the political declaration, of course, in topics, important and challenging topics like the security challenges which we are facing, and it's a common challenge for everybody of us. I will end saying that in 10 seconds that what Winston Churchill said in 1942, it was war, making reference to a dream of a future United States of Europe, where the freedom of movement will take place, they'll be once again on our common European agenda, not for tomorrow, but in the future. Thank you.
Next speaker is our colleague from the Czech Republic, Jan Skopeček.
Thank you for the floor. Just a couple of remarks so that I don't exceed the time. Most of us respect the decision of the UK, but often we hear the question raised that the British have made a stupid decision. And I think we should stop that and allow the British to make a decision about their own future. I think it's not respectful otherwise. Even if the British do leave the European Union, they won't be leaving our region. And I agree with everyone who says that they want to have as close a possible relationship with them after Brexit. And the next thing that we all have to work hard to achieve is to create the best conditions for bilateral trade. It is very necessary because there are countries which want to continue to trade with Great Britain after Brexit with as little obstacle as possible. So the Czech Republic, many of our small companies export to Britain, to the UK, and trade flows in the other direction. So we want free trade, we want free movement of goods. And the last point, the reason why the UK moved in this direction is because they were disturbed by the idea they couldn't decide over their own fate. And the European politicians
have said that after Brexit, that we should be careful that it doesn't come to similar tendencies in other countries. And I think many of us have forgotten about that, and we should think very carefully so that we don't have a similar trends in other EU member states. Thank you.
From Slovenia has the floor.
Thank you very much. Last week, in my area, we had the British Halifax flight that landed in our country. At the time, Slovenian partisans were saving the British pilots and brought them to another partisan airfield via different possibilities, and from there they could go to southern Italy, which was free at the time. So there are many historic links that unite us, and that is why what we think is that Brexit is an adventure that wasn't really thought about properly. It's going to be an adventure that will be extremely costly. We are very sorry about this Brexit decision, and I think most of the British people do as well. The good side to Brexit is that the rest of the European Union has moved much closer together, which I'm happy about, because there were some ideas that were saying that due to Brexit, the European Union as such would fall apart. I'd like to use one of the sentences of my friend from Scotland. Scotland voted in favor of its European friends. That's what he told me, and that is why I would like to launch an appeal to all of you. Not that you think about how we should continue, but that you think.
Estonia has the floor.
Thank you, Austria, for organizing such a great event.
And I'll switch to Estonian, because European unity is just as important as our own languages. The discussions around Brexit have shown how important unity is for Europe and how difficult the situation may become if we cannot find a solution. The discussions have been ongoing for a while, and they are very hot in this hall as well. It's the same thing with the UN Migration Compact. It's a pity, really, that Austria has not joined it as presidency country, because that might increase the number of doubters. In Estonia, we very much hope that an agreement is reached in Brexit and in the compact as well. Thank you.
Our next speaker, Anastasios Kourakis from Greece.
Σε σχέση με την διαδικασία της εξόδου του Ηνωμένου Βασιλείου από την Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση,
as to the United Kingdom's withdrawal from the EU, we think that 2 points must be borne in mind. On the one hand, we should refrain from adopting a hard position which leads to too many constraints on economic activity in Europe, and we shouldn't allow it to lead to hard borders. Secondly, we need to be vigilant to ensure that nationalist forces do not gain in strength throughout Europe, because we have seen incipient nationalism in several countries. And thirdly, in the relations between the EU and the United Kingdom, we must bear in mind that these relations are at a historical low, and this low is based on certain developments. So we need to ensure that in this agreement, the voice of the British people is taken into account and respected. Thank you.
Als nächster zu Wort gemeldet Florian Hahn.
Next is Florian Hahn for Germany. Yes, Chair, colleagues. First, my thanks to our Austrian hosts, and if you perhaps allow me as a Municher and a Bavarian to say that sometimes Vienna is closer to us not only than Berlin, not only in kilometers but also in our hearts. So I have to say that the ideas, these enemies of the enemies of Europe are rubbing their hands because of what's going on. Well, that makes me quite sad. The UK is leaving the European Union in March, and so it's important that we really do manage to come to an agreement about the withdrawal so that we can win time in order to bring the other issues so that we can have an orderly departure. So a withdrawal agreement is important so that there isn't a cliff edge and a legal black hole. This is important for citizens of the UK and of Ireland and of the rest of the European Union. They don't deserve this. So I think it's very important also for our economies that we manage to reach agreement. So if you allow me also to say that we regret Brexit, but we respect the decision. It's a democratic decision. And over the long term, we would like to have a close relationship with the UK because the UK is and will remain part of Europe. But it's important in all of the negotiations that the UK shouldn't receive a competitive advantage over the rest of the European Union, because then Brexit would become an attractive model for the future for other countries, and that might cause other similar developments in other member states. Thank you.
Next speaker, Lech Kolar.
Panie Przewodniczący, koleżanki, koledzy, chciałbym przedstawić kilka tez związanych z Brexitem. Sam fakt osiągnięcia porozumienia.
Dear colleagues, thank you very much. On Brexit, the fact alone that an agreement between Great Britain and the European Union was achieved is already a success in itself. It's a major fact and it's promising. The agreement guarantees the right for Polish citizens who are in the UK to remain there, and we would also like to make sure that freedom of movement is guaranteed for all EU citizens and that their qualifications continue to be recognized, and that happens on the basis of reciprocity and doesn't lead to any discrimination. The UK representative was mentioning the Polish nurse, and I would like to state there are 1 million Poles in the UK at the moment. So Poland has major expectations as far as the Polish declaration for the future relationship between the European Union and the UK is concerned. Certain rules should be established for economic policy, for safety, for security. Poland is ready to contribute and to accept constructive solutions for the future as long as the joint rules for negotiation are recognized, and there has to be a balance between rights and duties. The integration of trade, of customs, etc., are important as well. And it is especially the cooperation in foreign policy, in defense and in security, which is important for us. We should develop a special model of cooperation with the UK in this regard, which should be more progressive than the present model of cooperating with third countries. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Next speaker from the European Parliament, Myriad McGuinness.
Thank you, Chair, and my thanks to the three excellent contributions. I'm going to be guided by the book of Ecclesiastes, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak. I'd rather be silent, but I'm going to speak calmly because I do need to speak. This is a critical week for the negotiations. We welcome the draft withdrawal agreement, and we know that consideration has been given to it not just across Europe but in the United Kingdom. I think we all, as Democrats, respect Lord Boswell's comments about patience and understanding and flexibility, and also your desire that we don't burn our bridges, and if I could add, that we don't build borders between us, borders of the mind or indeed hard borders. I'm also concerned about Sir Cash comments where you say that no one knows what's going to happen and that the withdrawal agreement has rather a bleak future. And I think that speaks to the reality that a democratic decision in the United Kingdom, which we respect, has implications in other democracies, and therefore that no man is an island, as somebody else has said. And how are we going to find a way out of this bleak scenario if we cannot come to a compromise? And I'm afraid that all too often the word compromise is disregarded and disrespected. Lastly, the European Parliament stands ready to do our part, to analyse and to vote on this withdrawal agreement in the hope that if we succeed, we can then have a strong platform on which to build a future relationship. Thank you.
Next speaker from France, Sabine Tillet.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you also for the excellent organization of this event. I'd like to say, in addition, Ms. McGuinness, yes, there is also a moment to act, and I think the moment has now come. I listened to what our colleague Sir William just said, who explained why this agreement is not perfect. Certainly not. It's not perfect for the United Kingdom. It's not perfect for the European Union either. But at least, given the interdependence which the EU and the UK find themselves, there can be no perfect agreement. The one we have before us at least has the merits of regulating maybe not all issues, but at least it provides a temporary solution which allows us to act better, because our enterprises and our fellow citizens today need visibility, and we bear responsibility, common responsibility, so it's time to act. And I would call for the responsibility of the House of Commons, and let me underscore our solidarity with Ireland. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Jaak.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much, Sir Cash. That was an excellent overview. Well, reasons. We are talking about the withdrawal agreement. We're talking about Ireland. But when I think back to previous COSACs, when I've asked Vice President Timmermans, what is your understanding of why people voted leave in the UK? Well, up until now, I've not really heard any substantial answers. People accuse fake news, whatever, but there doesn't seem to be any substantial reason. So this is homework that has not been done, and that's very dangerous. If we haven't really given that much thought, we can't really forecast what's going to happen in the remaining member states. We talk about excellent relations, keeping excellent relations with the UK. There is, however, worries about danger to the integrity of the UK. But a quick question to Sir Cash. What if the withdrawal agreement is not passed at the House of Commons? If there's a no agreement Brexit, what do you think the real economic result of that could be? Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. The next speaker is Genk Polo from Albania.
Ja, vielen Dank, Herr Vorsitzender. The Brexit is
Thank you, Chairman.
a development for Europe. the European Union and the United Kingdom, and it will have enormous consequences for peoples on both sides of the channel. There will be consequences for the EU, there will be for the United Kingdom, but also recent international studies reveal also negative economic consequences for the Western Balkans accession states. And as we heard, the future of the withdrawal agreement already agreed between Brussels and London is uncertain, and we all hope for the best agreed solution, but we don't know what will happen. We don't do crystal ball, as we heard. We have to look beyond that, and whatever the future course of action will be, we hope to see a United Kingdom committed to continental Europe, including the Mediterranean, with its unique capabilities and benign influence. Thank you.
Our last speaker is Ulrike Hiller from Germany.
Yes, thank you very much, Chairman. I'm very happy that the last word was given to a woman and that I can make my contribution to the discussion. I would like to point out again that on the one hand, we have lawyers who hopefully will come up with good contracts, but they also have the full responsibility of making sure that in these stormy times they look in a careful way to the fact that we're not damaging too many things here. My main concern is this. If we have a contract, or which is possible but hopefully won't happen, no contract, at the time between March and May will have to be used properly. I hope that these will 2 months where there will be no idea in Europe that will look for more emotions, that will concentrate on too many things that keep us apart, and that we will really be estranged even more at the end of this. I think we will really have to look at what it means for the citizens on our joint continent. They will have to stay together in this region, and we'll have to see exactly what it means for young people. What I see is that there are many statements, many comments made by young people who are studying, who would like to go to the UK, who would like to have this exchange. And I think that that is something we have to remember as well, that we have a joint future. We have to make sure that it stays like this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. In our last meetings, we decided that we will take our time for discussion, and we had 37 participants in our debate. I would like to thank all of you for your contributions and for the time discipline. Now we will have the closing remarks by our speakers. First will be Lord Boswell.
Well, thank you, President. Thank you, President. I think this debate speaks for itself. And what I'm going to do is reiterate my 3 points in conclusion, and then perhaps also do, as there are many educationists in my family, use a visual aid, which I've also used in the chamber of the House of Lords. I'm going to start with the last one, which is the importance of maintaining bridges between us. And I think this debate has spoken for itself in highlighting some of the issues for your countries, as for ours, in trying to resolve this issue in an amicable and orderly way. Secondly, has been the issue of understanding, and I think without unpacking the issues of the referendum, we probably have a better understanding of the complexity of this and the interaction and the trade-offs required than ever we did before the country made the decision it did, and the negotiations have now proceeded. And thirdly, a degree of sympathy from you on the importance of not only understanding intellectually, but also understanding emotionally some of the currents of opinion which have surfaced in the United Kingdom and I think are also shared in other member states. Now, I promised a visual aid, and it's simply, I think, to point to the question which we will have to answer if there is a no-deal Brexit, and in particular, if we find ourselves running short of time. Can we meet the practical requirements? This is my European health insurance card. I started by making some personal remarks about my health. I have no chance of getting commercial insurance if I travel across a European border. Is this going to be valid or not? And that is the kind of question which 600 million of our citizens will be asking each other if we don't get this matter to an orderly conclusion. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Next is Sir Kesh.
Well, thank you all very much. I found it fascinating, but I fear that we're not really talking to one another. And I say that because although I hear many people saying that they want to respect the decision, I do come back to the question about the wood for the trees and the crystal ball. There is a question which is not being tackled, and that is, which countries do not want to govern themselves? What is democratic self-government? Isn't that what people fought and died for all over Europe? Twice in the last 150 years? And we have to ask these questions. Are we in fact going to be in a situation where people have laws imposed upon them without their will, by a majority vote, against their wishes? These are serious questions, and they cannot be dodged. Who calls the shots? Where do the subsidies come from? And the question of unity, I agree with, in the sense in which we want full cooperation and good trading relationships, but not at any price. The price of democracy is completely unchallengeable. Democracy is the basis upon which Europe has to function. And it doesn't just mean because the EU, with an unelected commission, imposes laws and then they're decided behind closed doors in the Council of Ministers and are decided and imposed upon you, and you then agree to accept them. I have always passionately believed, I voted yes in 1975 in the referendum then. I believed very strongly we did not want peace, we did not want war again in Europe. My own father was killed in the war in 1944, got the Military Cross. I understand personally these questions. But I have to say to you that as I got in the House of Commons, I came to realize that what was said is not what is happening. And more concentration, and more domination, and more centralization, diminishing the roles of the national parliaments. Why do you think people are voting with their feet in more and more parts of Europe? That's the question that some people need to ask themselves. And I don't, by any means, I've fought against the far right all my life. But I have to say that there are people from the centre-right who now appear to be moving further to the right out of a degree of frustration. So my answer to your question is, I do think that we need to be listening to one another as to what democracy really means. And if you talk about youth unemployment, I'd simply say this. If you look at the figures for youth unemployment, those young people whose futures are so important, it varies between 20 and 50% in different parts of the European Union. They have no future. That is something which is the consequence of economic mismanagement. And the other thing is, if you ask the question from the point of view of the British people, and I'll finish on this note, there is no intention of changing the framework of the acquis. There has been no intention of reforming from within, no intention of opening up the degree of democratic transparency. And from a purely economic point of view, just this point, we run a deficit with the 27 member states of about £80 billion a year. That's a very big deficit. If I may say so, Germany has a surplus with the same 27 of £104 billion a year. And that means that from the British point of view, if you look at the imbalances that exist, we say to ourselves we want to trade with the rest of the world as well. That's what this independent trade policy idea is about, so that we can trade it with Europe, with you, and also across the world. And 90% of all the future economic growth in the world comes from outside the EU. These are serious questions, but above all else, I come back to the word democracy, and I'll leave it at that.
Final remarks by Mrs. Danuta Hübner from the European Parliament.
Thank you very much. I would like to maybe first address the issues which colleagues were raising, mostly from Germany, I think, but not only about the mixed agreement and the whole clarification also of the role of national parliaments. So this agreement is an exit agreement. This is not an agreement on the future. There is a political declaration which is not a legally binding document, which is, this declaration is also envisaged by Article 50, and that's why the procedure is very precisely there in this article presented. It is only, it is a member state agreement, so it is only the parties to this are only European institutions, which is the Council and the European Parliament and the European Council. It requires only qualified majority in the Council and a simple majority in the European Parliament. The distinction between the mixed agreement and normal agreement comes only with regard to the agreements between the European Union and third countries, or I don't remember if the treaty calls them external countries. And this will be the agreement about the future relationship, where the procedure will be very different, where the procedure will require unanimity, will require ratification by national parliaments, and that means also that there will be the possibility for this part of the agreement, which belongs to European competences, to have this provisional implementation of the agreement. But for the agreement with a member state, we don't have this possibility, as Mr. Kirbaum was mentioning. So I would like to make it very clear. And also the 585 pages is the withdrawal agreement. The declaration, political declaration, will be probably will not go beyond 20 pages, so it will be short. And the 585 pages, because we are dismantling 45 years of relationship with an important big member state. The second issue which I would like to raise is some colleagues were talking about Plan B, meaning especially the situation with a no deal. So just one word on no deal. No deal would mean that there is no backstop in place, that the citizens' rights, which we have been negotiating during the first at least 6 months with a lot of interchanges also with British administration, this will not exist. So no deal has dramatic consequences for all the most important areas of the negotiations, and this probably, you can imagine, for the economy, for transport, for aviation, for everything, for the customs, for the small and medium-sized companies that in most of our countries never ever functioned outside single market. So these are things which we have to take also into account, and that's why in December, I think last year, half a year later than we started the negotiations, the European Commission started also the process which is called preparedness, which means exactly taking into account of the challenges or distortions that can be produced by a no-deal scenario, among other things. And we have this preparedness effort at the European Union level with more than 75 notices on the web of the Commission. You can see consequences sector by sector, what it means that the UK will become a third country. And then at the level of member states, there are many. The Dutch, I think, they are coming to Brussels and boast of how well they are prepared for the situation. I think there is a huge lesson that can be learned from some member states. Germany, we also saw it in Belgium, in Poland, but so one can learn from, I think, member states what must be done at national level, where you have not only the need to employ more people in all the services, which are especially the customs services, but also make legal adjustments, and this is important. But the most important and most difficult part of this preparedness, of this Plan B preparation, is among the firms, as the companies, the big transnational European or global firms, they have started the contingency planning and action already 2 years ago, just around, like, before even the referendum. But for smaller firms, this is a bigger cost, and they are it's also more difficult. That's why some member states are also helping the SMEs, even financially, to get the expertise. So this issue is a big issue where really the role of national parliaments, making the member state, the governments accountable for the preparation of the country in all those areas which belong to national level competences. For example, the extradition, which we do normally on the basis of national law and only our citizens to another member state, and UK will become a third country. So this is just an example. The third thing which I would like to respond to Mr. Appledorn, because I think this famous deal that we had in February 2016 with Mr. Cameron was actually never used, as you know. It was not even mentioned during the campaign, not presented. So it was, and it ceased to exist after the results of the referendum, in line with the clause which was there in this deal. Now, after leaving, because some colleagues were saying, of course, after UK leaves, there can be in some years a change of heart, change of mood, and there might be the will to join back. And Article 50, again, is very clear. Number 4.5 of this article is clearly saying that there is Article 49, which means normal accession to it's not nasty politicians who are saying that, it is envisaged in the treaty. So I regret this very much. Somebody was, Madame Mehmedova was mentioning the rumors about citizens. Then also I think Mr. Erlander from Sweden was mentioning how important it is. This is something which is absolutely fundamental, because that was negotiated and we agreed on the basis of reciprocity for the best possible treatment of all our citizens who will be there by the end of transition. So you have to do it by the end, before the end of transition, to get this settled status and all the rights which have been negotiated. But this is not a guarantee for the citizens who will be then subject to future relationship agreement, where UK is not seeing the possibility of changing the red lines, so they don't want to be in the single market. And Mr. Kirchbaum, I think, was mentioning also this approach of picking up only some things which will not be possible. So we have to see that the freedom of movement is not, at the time, for the time being, on the list of what UK would like to have. And one more thing, which is this indefinite extension, which, I'm sorry, extension of transition, with Mr. Sir Cash mentioned, because that's simply not the good reading of the draft agreement, because there is only once extension if the UK will need it, only once the possibility of extension, and it will be a joint decision. So UK cannot extend the transition to its taste, but it will have to be decided jointly. And then there are also other comments of Mr. Cash which I would like, but they are political, so I don't think that we are all free to have our political views and approach to this very painful, I think, said nonsense. Thank you.
I would like to thank Mrs. Hübner, Sir Cash, and Lord Boswell for their final remarks. I'm convinced that the Brexit discussions will stay on the agenda for the next weeks to come. Let me now close the morning session.